We had
cancer.
unusually heavy snows, but also unusually, we had about 70 inches of snow, but it stretched over 2 or 3 days, but it was.
That's
the-
yeah, that
yeah, yeah,
was
that's-
serious.
Yeah, yeah,
We
that's-
couldn't. There was a time when for a week everything was shut down.
Yeah, that's-
in
that's-
BC. We couldn't move.
Yeah.
6 feet.
Yeah,
That's close to 6 feet, almost
it was
6 feet.
high. It
high.
covered cars and
Yeah,
whatever.
covered
It
cars
was
and everything.
bad. I mean,
But it
we
came,
couldn't-
it came in several, the biggest single fall was 39 inches, about 3 feet. But then there was another one of 20 inches, another one, yeah, it was covering cars. But the unusual part about it was not just the depth of the snow, but that it lasted so long. Washington, as Johnny now has learned, we get snow during the winter, but it'll be a snow and then it melts and it's gone, and so we never
Doesn't
have,
stay.
it's not like up in Michigan and Minnesota and places like that where the snow just sets in and the cold weather sets in. We have breaks in the weather and never is snow on the ground or frozen or freezing weather for very long. So that was a real unusual winter, because it stayed, I guess, for 3, 4 weeks
Yes.
or more. The snow didn't melt, it stayed ice, really cold, below freezing. We are being webcast live, and so our live audience out there is watching us mill around and chat about Kindle books. So we better get started on something serious. I'm Steve McDonald, the head of the Africa program here at the Wilson Center. So welcome to the Wilson Center. For Luvuyo's sake in particular, I think a little more than I normally do about the Wilson Center. As most of you in the audience know, it's the living memorial to former President Woodrow Wilson, who is a man who's, there's controversial opinions about Wilson in his international policies and his domestic policies. But one thing that he very keenly stood for, because of his own academic background, he's the only president ever for the United States to have a PhD, and was president of Princeton University, of course, is that he really cared about the intersection of, as he put it, the world of ideas and the world of policy. That is, bringing together with policymakers, those who work in the field, who are experts, who are academics, who are practitioners, and to help inform and, we assume, therefore, make better policy. So the Woodrow Wilson Center is dedicated to that proposition, and it's just such meetings as this where we bring together people who are intimately involved in the events of the day to talk about those things. So today we're very, very proud to be hosting Luvuyo Mandela, who's a social entrepreneur and lead consultant for Tia Muzi Services. He's an ambassador for Cheese Kids for Humanity, an organization that creates outlets for people to give back to their neighboring communities. He'll tell us about his work. He'll be talking about youth in South Africa and impacting the future. So he'll be speaking to us. I've asked a couple of other friends to join us to round out the program. The first is Johnny Maloto, who is the Deputy Ambassador in the South African Embassy here in Washington. Johnny's been here for about 4 years. He's an experienced hand. He's a professional and career Foreign Service officer, and he's been a good friend of mine. I'm very happy to have him here, representing his own ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool. And then we're going to have a few remarks at the end of the presentations by J.P. Landman, who has just arrived. He's been here for 1 week with his wife. 1 week as a public policy fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm really happy to have him. He's a visiting professor at the University of the Free State, and he's authored a lot of things. He's very well known in South Africa for his writings on the economy and business and other things, and that's where I first met him in Cape Town. But he's just published a book called The Long View, Getting Beyond the Drama of the South African Headlines. And I thought that very well fit into the theme that Luvuyo is going to be developing for us. I'm particularly happy to be hosting an event like this, and Johnny's heard this before, because my own connections to South Africa run deep and long. I lived and worked there from 1976 to 1980, married to a South African. A son of mine was born there. Traveled back there all the time, been intimately involved with the country for many, many years. And so obviously I wish it well. I have a little stake in that, that it comes off well. And we're very happy this morning to have Luvuyo Mandela give us a few encouraging words, I think, about the future of South Africa. But first I'm going to ask Johnny Maloto to come up and say a few words in greeting for his country.
Thank you, Steve. You gave me a very difficult task. I know it's always nice to be at the Wilson Center, but when you say you can speak about anything, that's a very tall order, particularly when you are in the company of such august, panelists like JP and Luvuyo. But I thought what I would do would just, as Steve requested, to set the scene, just to give a broad overview of, South Africa over the past 20 years. As you know, we're on the eve of our 20th anniversary, and just to do a broad overview so that I can allow Luvuyo and JP to just give a much more focused presentation. I think this event comes at a very opportune time when we are poised to celebrate our 20th anniversary of freedom and democracy in April next year. As you know, we voted for the first time under a democratic dispensation in 1994, 27th April. And the occasion of our freedom and democracy was truly an inspirational one. We had a popular president. We're talking the language of reconciliation and nation building. We had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the sins of the past. While the vestiges of apartheid were all around us at the same time, who were basking in the glory of what was something very remarkable, and we're truly honored to be part of that history in the making. For us, at the time, at least everything was going in the right direction. Some observers even called our achievements nothing short of a miracle. You've all heard of the miracle, South African miracle. In reality, though, the negotiated political settlement that came in 1994 was a result of tough decisions and choices to arrive at what one observer called a much better than it might otherwise have been turned out result. It's quite a mouthful, but actually, the naysayers at the time, had all doomsday predictions about the future and destiny of our country. Obviously, we knew that things could have, in reality, gone really bad, but they did not. We could have fallen prey to all the stereotypes and failures associated with post-independence malaise that have accompanied many a popular liberation state, but we did not. Through the visionary leadership provided by the founders of our nation, we were able to chart a path towards a prosperous and democratic nation. So our story not only inspired, but also provided hope for the future. So let me hasten to mention, though, that coupled with these inspirations were the hopes of many and expectations as well as fears that could only be addressed through very tangible deliverables. So we knew what the challenges ahead of us were at the time. Obviously, today we face a very different set of challenges in the face of growing expectations and dwindling resources. But our people remain hopeful. According to the latest Youth Hope Index, a survey conducted at regular intervals by consumer insights company Pondering Panda, 56% of our young people feel that South Africa will be a better place to live in the next 10 years. This equals the highest figure recorded previously, which was in January this year. To take our people to this destination that the youth expects, we need to do some serious reflection and determine where do we go from here. We are working towards a present that is better than the past and a tomorrow that will be better than today. In the process of getting there, this journey will also produce its own set of leaders who will not only inspire and bring hope, but will also provide innovative solutions to address the growing expectations of their fellow citizens and beyond. This is the story of South Africa. However, the story is not ours alone, as Steve has already alluded to. That is why we're here. It's a story that inspires, that brings hope, and it's a story on a topic that is very timely, not only for us, but I think for the world. So in the same way that we inspired hope all those years ago, we have also come to create more expectations. We came to be regarded as a beacon of hope in the areas of social justice, human rights, as well as equality. Whether we wanted this responsibility or not is immaterial, because the expectation is there. This is a big responsibility, and at the dawn of our democracy, we embrace this as attested to by our constitution, which is the cornerstone of our democracy. Regarded by many as amongst the most progressive constitutions today, it identifies the values that we stand for, namely human dignity, human rights, non-racialism, non-sexism, supremacy of the constitution and the rule of law, regular elections, and a multi-party system of democratic government, to ensure that we realize accountability, responsiveness, and openness. So how have we done then in the past 20 years, and what lies ahead for the next 20? In the past 4 years while I was here in the US, a response to this question would have invoked many conflicting responses. In the past 4 years, there have been many forums such as this one, as we spoke earlier on with Steve, but most of them surrounding around the topic of whether we remain true to the promise of creating a better life for all. You will perhaps be relieved to hear that this is the conversation that we hold amongst ourselves as South Africans every day of our lives. So you see, we are used to being under the microscope and scrutiny of others. We have been for decades, but we also happen to be our own most ardent critics. We fully appreciate difference and understand that there will always be alternative perspectives, narratives, and even expectations about how our story should unfold. We also understand that this story is ours, and only we can determine how it unfolds and concludes. So where others see unrest, we see democracy in action. Where others finally wake up to the realization that Africa is the next big story, It confirms what we've always known and been saying since the dawn of our democracy, that Africa is the centerpiece of our foreign policy agenda, and Africa is the continent of the future. Where others think that we are punching above our weight, we remain convinced that we have made the right decisions and taking responsibility to be an active member of the global community of nations in the quest to find solutions to global problems. We have come a long way since 1994. We have gone through successive democratic elections, with the fourth one beckoning in 2014. Each of the administrations that we have had have focused and addressed a specific set of priorities that needed attention at the time. Notwithstanding differences in leadership styles, each of the successive presidents that we have had have presided over calm and peaceful periods of democratic rule, and each have continued on the basic vision adopted at democracy, supported by relevant policies resulting in tangible outcomes that have progressively moved us closer to the dream of a better life for all. In August last year, our government adopted the National Development Plan, popularly entitled Our Future, Make It Work. The document is a sober analysis of our achievements and shortcomings over the past 18 years, and it provides a long-term vision of where we need to be in the year 2030. It is based on the result of a highly consultative process in which all South Africans from all walks of life participated in a frank and open dialogue. We have made remarkable progress in transition from apartheid to democracy. In every facet of life, advances are being made in building an inclusive society, rolling back the shadow of history and broadening opportunities for all. We have been able to build institutions necessary for a democratic and a transformative state. Accesses to services have been broadened, the economy has been stabilized, and non-racial society has begun to emerge. Millions who were previously excluded now have access to education, water, electricity, healthcare, housing, and social security. About 3 million people are working today, more than in 1994. The poverty rate has declined and average incomes have grown steadily in real terms. At the same time, we do realize that after 18 years of democracy, South Africa remains a highly unequal society where too many people live in poverty and too few work. The quality of our school education, particularly for black learners, still remains poor. The apartheid spatial divide continues to dominate our landscape. A large proportion of young people feel that the odds are stacked against them. To accelerate progress, deepen democracy, and build a more inclusive society, we need to translate political emancipation into economic well-being for all. This means that we need to focus a lot more on growing the economy in order to realize the fruits of the democratic dividend. Statistically, South Africa has the relevant demographic profile to get the economy going. Today, the labor force, that is those between the ages of 15 and 64, makes up 64% of the population, with a proportion of children and the elderly comprising smaller shares. Internationally, demographic profiles such as these are often associated with rising incomes, faster productivity, higher savings, and rising living standards. Alternatively, they can lead to a frustrating and destabilizing environment where young people cannot get work, contributing to violence, crime, alcohol abuse, and other social ills. The determinant of success is whether a country can harness the advantage of having a large number of people who are able and willing to work. To do so means providing them with the education skills and helping school leavers to find work that is stimulating and through which they can fulfill their aspirations. But it's not enough just to provide these resources. We also need to create the space and the opportunity for the youth to thrive. It is quite clear to us that a lot more investments need to go into youth development and creating opportunities for them. We should not take for granted the immense power and influence of the youth. After all, who can forget the historic significance of the Soweto student uprising of 1976 that unquestionably transformed the political landscape and the resistance movement in South Africa and the world? Young people have always had their finger on the pulse of current social trends. They have always been part and parcel and central to the rhythm of national life. Since the Soweto uprising, each succeeding generation has understood that it faces the responsibility to carefully understand its political, social, and economic conditions, accordingly to set its own agenda so that it can contribute to a better human condition. Our current generation of young people understand that they owe it to history to protect and champion the ideals of social justice, an abiding culture of human rights, and a humane and just and equitable social order. As South Africa, we know very well that beyond our own domestic challenges, our youth are connected to and take lessons from global struggles of taking charge of one's destiny. After all, it was our forebears who charted this path for us by waging one of the most successful international human rights campaigns, the struggle against apartheid. Today's event featuring Luvuyo follows in this tradition. As a young leader in South Africa today, he understands that he cannot be on the sidelines of history if he wants to be part of the South African story. Encouragingly, our leaders understands this changing new world. In his Youth Day address on 16 June this year, President Zuma reported that the government was prioritizing youth development for a good reason. The results of the census that was done in 2011 reveal that South Africa is a very youthful country. More than 50% of the population is under 39 years. Further, for the next 20 years, South Africa will have over 14 million young people between the ages of 15 and 29. The number will peak in 2021, reaching 15.1 million. In order to harness this advantage of having a large number of young people who are able and willing to work, President Zuma announced that he had directed that the expanded public works program, which provides temporary work opportunities for the unemployed, to insist that 40% of these opportunities must go to young people. He also announced that the Small Enterprise Funding Agency, formed after merging all business financing institutions, will make available close to $170 million for the next 5 years for young youth enterprises, with a target of 22 million in this financial year. Further, the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa has announced a further $100 million to fund youth-related opportunities. We expect that the youth will take this advantage and many other opportunities, and in return, they will bring to the table fresh ideas, innovative technologies, entrepreneurship, more accountable and transparent government in order to address some of today's most pressing problems. As we transition to our 20th anniversary of freedom and democracy, we are hopeful that about what the future holds in store. The lessons of history are not ours alone, neither is the hope for the future. So the solutions to some of the world's and future world's problems may well come from developing countries. I think the Wilson Center understands this. I think President Obama understands this, hence his Young African Leaders Initiative. I think today's panel, consisting exclusively of South Africans from different generations, backgrounds, will present an interesting take on South Africa today and the future. I thank Luvuyo and JP for making themselves available for this discussion and look forward to hearing their insights on this topic. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for setting the context and allowing me to then dive right into the talk today. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, leaders and scholars and academics, and welcome to our brief engagement this morning. Before turning into our topic today, I would like to take a moment to thank two officers that worked together to create our platform this morning. Thank you to Lorena Aguilar, Global Senior Gender Advisor in the Office of the International Union of Conservation of Nature, who reached out to Steve McDonald, Director of the African Program and Leadership and Building State Capacity in the Woodrow Wilson Office, for organizing our event this morning. I would also like to thank everyone who took the time to join us this morning. I am humbled to know that you all believe in the ideas of young people and you believe they are worth your time. I trust you will lend your wisdom to the discourse and the actions that may result from our time together today. Your presence today is a testament to what can be achieved when human beings engage one another, suspending, at least for an hour or so, agendas aligned to specific political parties and constituencies. I hope we can engage as people looking to ask hard questions so that we can work together to answer them. in line with the vision of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Recent history has taught me that a topic about South Africa cannot be addressed without a bit of name dropping. The name that has the name that has in many circles become synonymous with the liberation and democracy is that of my great-grandfather, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. Many praise him and give him credit for our liberation, and some criticize him for not doing enough to liberate the people of South Africa and the masses. But my intention is not to dwell on whether or not he is deserving of all the praise, especially since I fear I am bound to obvious subjectivity and bias on the matter. Mine is to name drop only in an attempt to bring another perspective to the legacy discourse. In doing so, I would like to touch on mistakes we make when discussing his seemingly isolated legacy. There are a few critical omissions we make when we engage the iconic tale that is Nelson Mandela's life. And in making these mistakes, we make replicating even the smallest of his feats seem mission impossible. But as the man himself once said, it all seems impossible until it's done. His generation, sometimes collectively referred to as struggle heroes, paid great attention to detail. I believe this, among other reasons, is how they collectively turned the impossibility of freedom into the reality I and other young South Africans are now privileged to enjoy. Admittedly, it is a privilege that is not nearly as expansive as it should be, but this is a challenge that I will visit later in our engagement. His generation's collective attention to detail and their meticulous planning for the change was a major factor in the eventual achievement of democratic rule. But to address the elders' contribution as a collective requires the skills of a dedicated historian, which I am not. Allow me, if you will, to bend my rules and use Rolihlahla Mandela as an example to illustrate how young folk can impact our future, both as South Africans and possibly as the global community at large. I believe to better understand my great-grandfather and his generation of leaders, it is important to highlight particular details he himself has shared. Details he has privately shared through anecdotes to his family, details he has shared with the world through many autobiographies and publications, ranging from The Long Walk to Freedom to conversations with myself. I wish to address three such details. The first, the relatively humble, chieftaincy aside, rural village beginnings he hailed from. The second is the great mentorship and tutelage he was under in his traditional, national, and global roles. And the third is the incredible support system he had amongst his peers. These three details, at least to me, shed light on the great mystery of how he became the man celebrated and cared for today. A man from the small village of Mvezo who, as a result of mentorship, tutelage, an incredible support system, rose to overcome his life challenges and grew into the man claimed the world over as brother, father, a grandfather, and great-grandfather. We South Africans get to call him Tata. Father in isiXhosa. Tata inspires many today, but it is in the many who mentored and supported him and created a platform that allowed him to lead a great liberation movement. Post-apartheid South Africa has experienced a very colorful and eventful 19 years. We have milestones to celebrate and be proud of. We equally have many shortcomings we need to be honest about and confront. Honest introspection is very difficult. My elders need not fear nor take cover. This is not a finger-pointing exercise. I'm not here to harp on shortcomings of our fathers, but would rather encourage a discourse that helps us avoid simple pitfalls in future. Such engagements allow our elders to serve as guides and mentors to the energetic and enthusiastic bunch we young folk are. It seems we are no longer in the business of creating enabling environments that allow young rural men and women from all corners of the globe to rise to the occasion and help take their futures to the next level. We have spent too much time paralyzed by the fear of our inability to create another Chris Hani, Joe Slovo, Helen Joseph, Steve Biko, Lillian Ngoyi, Robert Sobukwe, Helen Suzman, Dulcie September, or any others who selflessly serve the people of South Africa. Crippled by our fear of not being able to create others, we have opted rather to elevate a handful to iconic status and aspire to achieve their individual success, forgetting that they their success is intimately intertwined and connected to the efforts of a collective. When we single out and celebrate the greatness of a few struggle heroes, forgetting the collective movement of which they were part of, we lose sight of what their bigger picture was. After singling out a handful, we focus on their individual success, leading to a generation that seeks only to achieve individual success in order to mirror the legacy of a handful, instead of aspiring to be part of a collective generation that uses the foundation already laid to launch our nation into the future. I believe the following quote best captures what I think we need to redirect our focus towards. In judging, and I quote, "In judging our progress as individuals, we tend to concentrate on external factors such as one's social position, influence, and popularity, wealth, and standard of education. These are, of course, important in measuring one's material success in material matters, and it is perfectly understandable if many people exert themselves mainly to achieve all these. But internal factors may be even more crucial in assessing one's development as a human being. Honesty, sincerity, simplicity, humility, pure generosity, absence of vanity, and readiness to serve others, qualities which are within easy reach of every soul, are the foundation of one's spiritual life." Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, Conversations with Myself. Many of us, young and old, have lost our readiness to serve others. The stalwarts of our South African liberation struggle were ready to lay their lives on the line in order to have a future where their nation's generation and great-grandchildren could stand and address scholars, academics, leaders, and citizens in any nation that would offer a platform. I stand here today at the Wilson Center as a manifestation of this dream. History demanded that some of our great-grandparents and grandparents give their lives for this dream, but our present demands only that we continue their work. Our current reality does not require us to end our lives in order to be heard. Our today needs us only to do better and work for the greater good for all. Losing sight of the group has redirected our efforts towards individualistic goals that only enrich ourselves and create wealth for those closest to us. And there it is, the elephant in the room, the biggest criticism of South Africa. We are quickly being known as a nation whose struggle heroes sacrifice their lives only to give rise to a South Africa that no longer thinks of a common good for all. But we can do better by replicating the enabling environments that gave rise to such incredible leaders in the past. Surely our leaders today can, like the leaders who preceded them, work together to build foundations for enabling environments. Imagine a global community driven by a common goal to build environments that allow for exciting possibility of the next generation of people being fully equipped and ready to serve others. But I cannot ask our audience to engage in sincere introspection without doing so myself. So here comes my moment of honesty. I am guilty of a paralyzing fear. I have always been petrified of not being able to fit the shoes, not being invited, not being smart enough, not being good enough, not being brave enough, not being successful enough, not making my parents proud enough. And all these fears have slowly eroded with a growing awareness of my great support system and the wonderful opportunities I've been given, all leading up to a recent experience that helped crystallize my personal revelation and redirection of my own ship. I was recently chosen as one of 5 South Africans to be sponsored by Brand South Africa to attend a 4th annual One Young World Summit. Further to this, I was also selected as one of the delegates to ask former Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Kofi Annan, a question. Needless to say, I was excited both to be part of the chosen few and also to hopefully engage with Mr. Annan in such a way that he would remember that I was one of the young people that posed a question that was thought-provoking. I shared this excitement with one of my mentors who said something I did not understand too well when he said this. He said I must not be too hard on Mr. Annan, but I will speak to that and share some of, I will speak to that after I share some of my awesome questions. Questions that were, I now know, unfortunately awesome for all the wrong reasons. Each pre-selected delegate had to follow a link in an email and fill in an online questionnaire. After answering a question ourselves, we were then given 3 blank spaces to question within 400 words. One Young World asked us, in your view, what is the most serious challenge your community, country, or region is facing? What role can you play to help build a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable world? My response was, our global community needs more educated citizens. We young people can collaborate on ways to disseminate high-quality education to as many younger minds as possible. Only then can we sincerely build a more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable world. We need more independent thought and a critical analysis. Granted, this is much easier said than done. Time is not necessarily always on our side, but we can no longer afford to act immediately when pressured by a sense of urgency, only to spend the balance of the time and money on doing relatively rushed solutions. It is no longer enough to be seen to be doing something. The cost of lives is too high. We need a variety of brighter minds and more of them at multiple levels in order to build the inclusive, equitable, and sustainable world we desire. Then the following questions. I recently had to explain to my sister what happy belated birthday means. She's 6 years old. This was a result of getting caught up in being a young adult, and although I had every intention to call her on her birthday, I unfortunately forgot only and calling her the next day. Worse than not calling on her birthday is that I cannot remember what I was doing that seemed so important at the time. To my sister, belated is a complicated and unnecessary adult extra that comes with growing up. More unfortunate still is that there are more problems we face in this world that are bigger than neglecting calling sisters and siblings on their birthdays. My fear is that the bigger the problems, the more complicated we become and the more adult extras we add. How, and the question was posed to Mr. Anand, how do we keep our focus on simple and important things we can and should be doing? How do we keep it simple and avoid adult extras? The second question. Our global paradigm seems focused on urban centers. Our thinking, questioning, and problem-solving hubs are often housed in various metros all around the world. Our problem-solving mediums seem only to compound and perpetuate the inevitability of rural communities playing catch-up. How best can we use technology to bridge that gap and to create more inclusive and consultative process? The third question, and this was more direct to Mr. Anand. Mr. Anand, you joined the UN infrastructure at the age of 24 as an administrative and budget officer of the World Health Organization in Geneva. You spent the following years within the structure until finally serving as a Secretary General of the United Nations. The One Young World generation is very entrepreneurial and thrives in smaller, more mobile vehicles that, while nimble, may not have the impact that we would love to have, at least not yet. Can realistic partnerships be forged between large organizations and the new age vehicles? Or should we be applying our minds and trades in the existing powerhouses? I did not get to ask my questions to Mr. Anand, but in hindsight, I am glad I missed the opportunity. I was not being fair to Mr. Anand, nor was I being fair to other South Africans who did not get an opportunity to attend the summit. I got lost in trying to emulate what I believe the few we have elevated to iconic status would have done. Forgetting about the collective, I sought to seize an opportunity to show attendees and organizers that I deserve to be there. The human ego is a very mischievous thing. They say everything happens for a reason. I believe my not getting to ask the question was a lesson in understanding international platforms and how best to utilize them for a greater good. My task was not to look for an answer from Mr. Anand, but to invite him and his peers to mentor us young and demanding folk on how better to serve others. I realized that we need guidance and not answers from our elders. We young folk need guidance from elders to refine our ideas and to assist us in implementing what we believe can help others. We need more enabling environments like the Wilson Center, where a young South African can stand proudly and honestly admit to being part of a nation that is learning and trying to do better for its people. There will be issues that demand global input, but also issues that require a more localized insight. it is important for our elders to understand the difference and to support both local and global platforms for change. But before I take too much of your time, let me leave you with my view of South Africa's past, present, and future. Our story is not perfect, nor our leaders infallible. Our democratization did not create an environment for our immediate triumph over the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination experienced by many in our country. While we may have momentarily lost sight of our goals for a greater good, we invite you to join us as we refocus and regain our momentum with vehicles like the National Development Plan, broad-based Black economic empowerment, and other pieces of legislation. Many spheres of society need to come together to ask difficult questions of our nations, leaders and members of constituency whom they serve at national, provincial, and local community levels, with a clear intention to continue the work of globally celebrated generation of leaders, both iconic and unknown. As we spend our last few months as teenagers in the global community, we need to take stock of how far we've come, the mistakes we have made, and prepare each other to be stronger leaders in tomorrow. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Luvuyo. A lot of food for thought there for us. And now playing the elder role will be J.P. Landeman.
Steve only chose me for the elderly role because of my hair color, nothing else. Listening to Johnny and Luvuyo, a couple of things a couple of common themes came out that I want to refer to. The first one is both of them made the point that South Africa has had a remarkable and successful political transition. By now, that's a bit of a faded statement. By now, that's a bit of a boring statement, until one reflects on Egypt and the Arab Spring, where political transitions actually did not go that well. So I don't think one should, just because the South African political transition was a success, I don't think one should therefore say it is preordained that all political transitions will be successful, former adversaries will find peace, and they will build a successful common society. I think it is a huge and a significant achievement that South Africans themselves should not forget, and should be a source of inspiration as they go forward. The second thing that struck me from both their sets of comments is a certain modesty and a certain introspection in saying, yeah, there are things that we've achieved, but there are also things that we have not achieved, and very importantly, we want to achieve more. I think that both of them made that point quite strongly. And on that score, I want to tell you about an incident I had about 2 years ago in my class at the University of the Free State. And I've got to give you some detailed background. First of all, it was a large accounting class, accountants, very important, people who need an extra lift in life. And there were 300 of them sitting there, and I was a guest lecturer in the accounting department, and I was going on and making a story. And the basic story that I made was also a theme that I developed in my book, is to say that I think South Africa is in a muddle-through phase. Politically, economically, we're in a muddle-through phase. We must recognize it, come to grips with it, and then muddle through. You know, it's what Winston Churchill said. If you're traveling through hell, there's only one thing to do: keep on motoring. And that was more or less the line of my class. And at the end of the class, a young, and forgive me for saying this, but it is important, a young black man got up and right at the back of the class, and he put up his hand and he said, Professor, I've listened to you, and that's fine. I buy the logic. But how can we, as a nation, develop a bigger ambition? Do you know, that question from that young student made me feel that big. Professor, how can we develop a bigger ambition? And in a sense, that's what I heard both these gentlemen say this morning, that they want the country, they come from a community where they want to do better, where they want to achieve more. And that is, of course, I think in a sense, an enormously good starting point. If there is the modesty and the openness and the willingness to say, yes, the past is the past, that's fine, we have achieved, but there's a hell of a lot more to be done. And I think with that kind of attitude and leadership, one can indeed achieve that. I want to focus on one specific aspect of what Luvuyo spoke about, and that is building communities, having a selfless attitude, and in a sense, helping one another. My wife and I have now been in the US for 7 days, and we are completely smitten. I have to admit that. And one of the things that we're completely smitten with is the incredible culture of volunteerism and culture of philanthropy which you find in the society. The Woodrow Wilson Center in itself is an example. You watch the news on television and you see the names of 10, 15 families, family foundations, individuals that actually contribute private money to make it possible to see that news webcast. Now for you this may be an absolute standard thing, and for you this is the way the world works. Let me assure you it's not the way the world works. Where the rest of us come from, either the government pays for it or advertisers. This thing of mobilizing society to make a contribution, I think is a fantastic characteristic of the United States of America and its people. And what I heard you say in a sense, Luvuyo, was to plug into that kind of value, to develop that value of selfless sacrifice, of building social capital, if you want, building networks with other, tackling this thing together and not alone. And if you put those three things together, the fact that the road that South Africa has traveled was by no means one of guaranteed success. Again, Egypt and the Arab Spring. But the success was pulled off. Now that must tell you something. It's a little bit like, do you accept Warren Buffett's credibility as a fund manager if you look at his track record? I think there is room for that kind of credibility. You link that with the ambition to do better, the ambition to achieve more than what has been achieved. And thirdly, you link it with the attitude of not just living for yourself, but living for the bigger society and the bigger community. You put those three things together, I think there's more than a betting chance that the people in the Pondering Panda survey, Johnny, that you referred to when you started, young people who say they believe that South Africa in 10 years' time will be a much better place, I think that confidence is not misplaced. The forces are basically there to take us to a better place again. We're better off than what we were 20 years ago. It can take us again to a better place 20 years from now. And for those three insights, I want to thank both of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, JP. I drew from Luvuyo's remarks much the same as you did, particularly the theme of the focus on the group and not on individualism. And certainly we know that the liberation generation was full of icons, as you've mentioned, individuals like your great-grandfather and many, many others who I had the privilege of knowing along the way, who were very focused on the collective. I draw one slightly different message from that. I appreciate your remarks, JP, on the sense of volunteerism and philanthropy here in the United States. I think that's quite true. But also we have a very, very strong individualistic streak here. We're seeing that come out just down the street here right now. and it's a lesson we have to learn too, Luvuyo. So as you look to your future and trying to regain that sense of group, I think the United States needs to do that too, particularly in our political headquarters. Well, now let's turn to an interaction with the audiences, which is the culture here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. As you all know, Luvuyo has agreed to have a discussion with you and field questions, as have the other panelists. Again, to repeat, we are being webcast live, I'm sorry. So you know the routine. I'll recognize you when you raise your hand, but wait for the microphone to come so that our listening audience and viewing audience can hear you as well. And then identify yourself and your association so we know who we're talking to. So with no further ado, why don't we open it up to the floor, get your questions, your responses, your critiques if you have. First hand I see is right here. The second hand is right here.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mandela, and the speakers. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. My name is Rosemary Segero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. We focus on conflicts and resolution, and I'm based here. The ambassador of South Africa is my favorite African ambassador, and he has given us motivation the way you've been given motivation to. So I came here on his behalf, on your behalf, and just to listen. On Monday, I attended an event on Arab youth, talking the way you are talking. They came from Lebanon, they came from Syria, they came from Egypt. They said elderly people have been coming, talking. Now they have come out of their own countries to come and seek what can they do for their country. And that's what you have done today. If you don't come up, nobody will be hearing about it. It will only be questions, as you said. How do you look at working with us? I work with a college, an organization in South Africa called FED College. It's for skilled training, young people who come out of university, because when they come out, they feel they're just going to get a job. They're not going to get a job. So we are turning into entrepreneurship by skill training through them. And then through my Kanban, I have started a venture capital which focus on young people and women trying to fund industries, not only work or something else. How do we work with you as young people? What you've said, you are talking on behalf of all African young people, not only South Africa. You are here on behalf, the way Mandela, the elderly president, spoke on behalf of Africa. How do you look the youth? Looking at the employment rate rising so high, getting into crime, violence. As I talked to you, my own son was killed by people who thought he had money. Just if they were working or doing something, they would have never killed my son. So how do we work with young people all over the world, with their presidents? Now that you've talked to Kofi Annan, you need to get to all the African states and tell them and talk to them what you are talking. So how do we work with young people, empower them, make them what they want, be what they want? Because you are the leaders of tomorrow. They won't be there. 2016, 2063 may not be there. We may not be there. But how do we do it now? Thank you, and thank you for representing Africa and South Africa. And keep up your good works, and I'll be doing election observation in South Africa. I may see you next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Lavuyo, I think we'll take 2 or 3 remarks, and then we'll, here is the next person, yes. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Stefan Norgard. I'm at U.S. Department of State, and I really enjoyed all of your guys' comments. Thank you so much for that. I'm specifically interested in the 2014 election, which I think you guys all mentioned or referenced, at least indirectly. And there's the Born Free generation, of course, that is coming of age for this 2014 election. So it's a very timely time to have this talk, especially with all of these guys voting for the first time in South Africa. And I'm curious specifically about the rise of the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF party. Julius Malema, I'm sure you guys know all about this. And the rhetoric of the EFF right now is really focusing a lot on this collective nature of the South African youth population. However, critics of the EFF are often saying that their policies might actually undermine democracy in South Africa. So I'd be curious to hear what your comments are on this dilemma.
Okay, very good. Oh, right over here. And then we'll stop for answers.
Hello, everybody. My name is Wangashi, and I'm a student at the George Washington University. Thank you to all the panelists, really incredible comments. I want to piggyback off the lady who spoke before regarding your representation of the continent. So just 2 quick questions for the panelists. How does South Africa take the responsibility on behalf of the continent? I think the country enjoys a very significant democratic, social, political maturity that the rest of the continent is still working towards. So what is South Africa's responsibility to the continent? And the second part is kind of contradicting the first part. You may, I'm sure, have talked to several Africans who have said South Africa is not Africa. It's actually Europe. You go to South Africa and investors will flock there and they won't experience the, so to speak, the potholes you would experience, say, if you were working in my home country, Kenya. So can South Africa really represent the continent?
Very good and very thought-provoking. And I think we might all have something to say on this. But let's start with Lavuyo, and then Johnny and JP, if you'd like to add.
We can't go elders first?
No. That's what you get for bearing that name.
To the first question, how do we work with youth? So I've recently taken the leap of faith to no longer be in the corporate environment and working within the social entrepreneurship environment. It's been the case as of April this year. And what I find is that there are a lot of platforms that are available for young people to actually speak. But again, like I also spoke to in the brief speech I delivered, is that we also need to gear up in terms of being responsible with those platforms. The Center of Memory, Nelson Mandela Center of Memory, along with Brand South Africa, recently hosted Mr. Mo Ibrahim for a dialogue on social cohesion and active citizenship. And while there are a lot of young people that are working in that environment, the opportunity was missed because a lot of them used it as a platform to actually advertise what they're doing rather than engaging with someone in saying, how can you lend your insights or how can you help guide this conversation? So I think in allowing more of the platforms so that people don't get excited by the opportunity of speaking to a billionaire and telling them, hey, this is what I'm doing. I think with more of those platforms where people gain an understanding in the context of the conversation isn't limited to that particular geographic space, but can allow an opportunity to unlock engagements that can both represent the continent and also allow for engagement to say, well, as the considered Europe of South Africa, what can we do to engage a lot better with the rest of our continent? I don't know if that answers your question. So we ourselves need to be responsible with the platforms and get ready for an engagement and get over the excitement of, oh my goodness, I'm speaking to Kofi Annan, which happened to me last week. In terms of EFF and the Born Freeze, it also speaks to the space of if, and this is not to badmouth any political organization, if we are more informed and are more comfortable with our command of what is happening in the world, we will not be taken for a ride by emotive language. And if we can be critical thinkers, then we can make up our own mind. So while there seems to be a big concern of EFF may drive the nation towards nationalization and everything else that they speak to, I think it's also important for young South Africans to be informed, and that also speaks to education and just generally getting an education infrastructure available to everyone to be able to be critical thinkers and assess the information that they're digesting. And that also speaks to an experience that I had also now leading to your question about Europe and South Africa being a Europe. I was engaging with a gentleman who does business in Senegal, Senegalese national, and he studied in Canada and since moved to Canada and started an organization that does advisory work on behalf of the IMF, the World Bank, and other such institutions on how to engage in responsible lending on the continent. And the one thing that he said, which I thought was quite strange to me, but it also came out in the One Young World Summit, is that sometimes we as South Africans are actually too hard on ourselves. We feel like the media keeps on bombarding us with, it's doomsday. Your country, excuse me for using the expression, your country is going to hell tomorrow. And everyone gets caught up in that euphoria instead of actually also being able to take a step back and saying, well, this is what we've achieved. There's a lot more work for us to do, and admit to that. And also be in a space where we then allow for platforms, and that's what I was speaking to when I say there's a lot more localized solutions and engagement that we need to have. So while we can engage on global platforms, and it's great to get insight from the first world or the developing world, it's also very important for us amongst ourselves as developing nations to say, we're intelligent people. We've studied abroad, we've got the degrees, come back home, engage with one another, and as a people, solve our problems. Yes, we can have the guidance and the interaction with the developing nations, but it's also very critical to translate the insights that we get from developed nations and make them make sense for us. A clear example of that is how people speak about renewable energy. And people will then say, I've got a solar panel, I'm going to take it, I'm going to put it in the rural areas, and you have great electricity. Now, for a lot of those people, unless you've trained them to say, and it's also an opportunity to create another industry, so unless you've trained them and said, this is how you go about using a solar panel, and you've trained a significant group of those people so that they themselves, once they understand the language, can roll out in their communities. So now you've created a group of trainers who are now employed, and it's in their best interest to roll it up to as many communities as possible. But we seem to miss that step in saying, we've got this great solution for you. We come and dump it in your environment, and then we wonder why people don't use it responsibly. They don't understand the technology. So it goes back to that space of saying, when we take the developed nations' solutions, we also have to take, it's our responsibility to contextualize them within our region and make sure that it makes sense to our people so that we can help roll it out. I mean, and I'm going to use a close expression because it makes sense in my head for now, but I'll translate it. When you bring a solar panel to a rural community, the response is, ndifuna umbani wasedolobhini, kutheni uzandiphathela umbani endingawaziyo mna? And that basically says, I want the electricity that I experience when I'm in the cities. I don't see solar panels when I'm in the cities. So if you're telling me you're bringing me a better solution, and my understanding of better solutions is in the city, why aren't you bringing me the electricity that's from the cities? Why are you bringing me this black box that apparently attracts heat? You know. So unless we actually start contextualizing these solutions that we bring, we're also shooting ourselves in the foot, because had we spent that little more time training the people up and making sure that they understand the technology, we wouldn't be spending so much time going back into those very communities, taking back the solar panels and still trying to roll out the electrification of rural areas. So had we spent a little more time in saying, well, you're not going to get electricity next year, but you can actually get it in 2 years. But in that space, we would have developed people from your region, your community, to roll out the training such that everyone understands and is on par. But then again, it's easier for me to say outside of government, it's a much bigger responsibility for them to manage both an expectation of, well, I've been waiting for 19 years. How can you tell me to wait another year? Versus rolling out something that is sustainable rather than trying to fix and plug holes. So that's me. To the elders.
Okay. Johnny and JP, would you like to throw in some comments? And particularly, I think, on the, what are the expectations of South Africa in terms of representing the continent? What's its responsibility towards representing the continent?
Yeah. Thanks, Steve. I think Luvuyo has said a mouthful already. Just on the question of the EFF and the forthcoming election, I mean, to the extent that it's helpful, I think our constitution provides for multi-party democratic elections. And any party that actually, qualifies to contest an election, they have a manifesto, they will present their case to the electorate, and you're hoping that you have a smart enough electorate. And we've had 3 successive elections, and I hope we have an electorate that is well educated by now. And by the way, as you spoke about the bond freeze, I mean, they are quite a very astute generation. We have probably some of the most politicized, also politically aware youth by global standards. So I think it's as I said, that we have an optimistic youth. We have a future that is quite positive, and I'm quite certain even the elections of 2014 would actually reflect the will of the people. But on the question, I think you raise a very important question, and it's a question that comes often. Nowadays, it's a question that we get quite a lot, the question of Africa and South Africa. And there is no Africa in South Africa, there's just Africa. We regard ourselves as a country that is a part of the African continent. From our foreign policy agenda from '94 that we adopted, that was the consolidation of the African agenda that places Africa at the center of our foreign policy, because whether you like it or not, geographically, we are destined to be in the continent. And it only makes sense for us that we should get our neighborhood in order for us to thrive. So when we look at our foreign policy agenda, we say we take the lens that says we look at SADC, then we look at the continent, then we look at the world. So we're an African country with an African perspective to global affairs. So we bring our own unique contribution to making sure that Africa is the continent of the 21st century, and that we achieve the aspirations not of ourselves, but of the entire population of the continent. The question that you address about, South Africa could never be Africa because of, the European, characteristics that it may have. That is, a result of our history, where we come from. You know, colonialism created such structures that created prosperity within certain areas and left other areas behind, and not bringing equitable development. And this is something that for the past 19 years at least our government has been preoccupied with. You probably have often heard the concept of, you know, the first and the second economies. Whenever you see cities in South Africa side by side, poverty exists with wealth. In Sandton, you have Sandton and Alex, you have Khayelitsha and Cape Town. You know, it's those contradictions that we live with. And whenever if I were to do a visual presentation, I would put Khayelitsha on the same slide and as Cape Town, say that what we are striving for is actually bring these guys into a modern, vibrant society that is a South African of the future. We're not striving for common poverty, but for the basics of what we exist for, that is a prosperous and modern day South Africa. So those are issues that we grapple with, and it makes it so difficult sometimes not to, you know, like JP was saying, that, you know, we try at all costs to be modest, but at the same time you want to showcase that we are, you know, a world player, we are a sophisticated economy, we are an investment destination, but we do all of that so that we can be able to have enough resources to bring those people that are in poverty out of that. But of course the world doesn't operate like that. It doesn't operate in a linear way. It's very cyclical, it's very complex, and we're always dealing with moving targets. The population grows, needs increase all the time, and we're plugged into the world economy. Today, when you don't reopen the government and you get downgraded, we have a serious problem. When Ben Bernanke announces, you know, makes the latest announcement, the rand takes a battering. So it's not as easy as that. You know, we would love if our economy was insular and we could do everything within the island of prosperity that is South Africa. But unfortunately, we have to manage all these complexities. This is the brave modern world that we live in. But as I indicated, I want to emphasize that we regard ourselves as a part of the African continent, and our lens to the world is through an African perspective.
But you know, there's an aspect, if I could just add to the question that Wangashi asked, there's another aspect that you see, and that is that there is a lot of resentment in other parts of Africa about South Africa. Your entrepreneurship, you know, every brewery on the continent now is owned by South African breweries. And some of it's perceptual, obviously. It's not a matter of fact. And maybe it's jealousy, maybe it's, but you do have to deal with that as you go out, and that's private sector as well as government. You know, businessmen who are going out to look for opportunities and et cetera. It's a little bit what America experiences as well. There's this sense of the ugly American. There's a sense of our aggressiveness, and so we always have to fight through that when we're establishing ourselves as business people or in government policy or whatever it may be, as we face the world. So that it does exist. Is any response on that? Yeah.
Well, JP, I don't know if you have any comments on that one, but I mean, that is something, you know, fighting perceptions is really counterproductive unless you deliver something tangible. Mm-hmm. So we have to lead by example. Our actions can only, you know, help in dealing with some of those perceptions. But to issue statements, communiques that, you know, don't actually tally up to reality, it's really in the end not going to. We are hoping, you know, when President Obama was in South Africa, he said, South Africa now has entered a new era where you are in the BRICS, you want to be in the Security Council. So that means you pitching yourself as a global player, you know. And in this regard, there are certain responsibilities and tough decisions that you'll have to take. Friends are no longer friends as you would have them traditionally, because there may be decisions that actually put you on a collision course with that. And even in this case, I think there will be really a huge responsibility on our shoulders to make sure that the message comes across consistently that whatever we do as part of a collective. We don't work outside the confines of the AU. Every other decision that we implement, particularly that has a bearing on the continent, we implement bearing into consideration what the AU provisions are and working within that collective. And I'm sure you will find that over the past few years, the decisions that we have taken since the launch of the AU has always been consistent within that framework. So I think it's something that's going to take time to getting used to, but at the same time, You know, there are other perceptions and narratives that are created that I believe, JP, you can address better, that speaks to a declining South Africa in the face of a rising Africa, which also is another perception that, you know, if you fall into that, it just creates policies that we don't want to go back to, of beggar my neighbor, you know, under apartheid that you had, where the country destabilized all its neighbors in the region so that it stood as a global or a regional power. So you don't want to go back to those periods in time that were really not productive but could only bring the continent down. What you're looking for now is a continent that actually works in a manner that is smarter. We're looking towards regional integration. It's a process that we fully believe in, that is going to actually make Africa a real global player and a player to contend with in the 21st century.
JP, anything to add on this or anything else?
I just want to respond to the issue of unemployment and unemployed youth that you raised, because I think it is a very, very critical issue, not just for South Africa, but for the world. Just consider this. In 1900, 113 years ago, there were 1.6 billion people on the planet. 100 years later, in 2000, there were 6.1 billion. You just swap the digits around. That's what happened over 100 years. Today, there are 7 billion. In the next 30 years, that number is going to rise to 9 billion. Is there anybody who realistically think that there will be enough economic growth on this planet to employ all these people in full employment? You know, the only people who still believe in that is the far left and the far right. Normally the ones who don't think. Anybody else will appreciate that you're sitting here with a demographic bomb that is busy exploding in the labor markets of the world. And I don't think there's one country in the world that is exempted from the shrapnel of this bomb. It certainly applies to South Africa as well. So if you look at the South African labor market, you find that there's a fantastic paradox. The media only tells you about one part of the paradox. But the paradox is South Africa is employing more and more people. The percentage of the working age population working keeps on rising and rising, and all of this is good and wonderful. But at the same time, as you employ more people, your unemployment rate and your unemployment number is also rising. That's the paradox. And we talk about this paradox as if the one, unemployment, is a function of a failure of the other one, employment. In my view, that is not the case. What we're dealing with here is a certain demographic reality. And that's why I think the value approach that Luvuyo put on the table today is so important if we want to go forward. The world, South Africa, I will not talk about the US, but certainly most countries of the world are simply not in a position where over the next 50 years they're going to create all the jobs for all the people looking for them. Not going to happen. We live in a completely different world. So you've put your finger on a vital issue, not just for South Africa, but indeed for the globe. About the EFF, look, 2 years ago, my wife is there, she can bear testimony to this. 2 years ago, I started saying to my friends, I'm white and Afrikaans and over 50 years old, and therefore I'm going to mobilize all my friends like me to now start voting for Mr. Julius Malema and the EFF. Why did I want to do this? Because I think, deplorable as their policies are, and you're quite right, their policies will be bad for South Africa's democracy. But their presence is not necessarily bad. I think the EFF in our political system, coming out, attracting a certain percentage of votes, whatever it is, giving a voice to the people who believe in those values which they articulate, can only help to mature the South African political system further. And here is the prediction I want to make. The more the EFF runs around, rabble-rousing, the more the ANC is going to move to the center. You see that when you look at politics all over the world. I think the comparisons between the EFF and the Tea Party in America are absolutely fantastic. Now, if you can have a Tea Party, and by all, by the looks of it, you will survive the Tea Party. It's putting you they're putting you through a bit of a ringer at the moment. But I'm quite sure you will sort that one out over time. I think you need sometimes a reaction in politics if you want to have a different action. So I'm not perturbed by them at all. I'm really, as I've already said, Steve, I'm smitten with America. But let me tell you, the other country that I'm very smitten with, partly because I go there a lot, is Germany. And Germany, every election they have, the Linke Partei get 8 to 9% of the vote. On that you can drink poison. Doesn't matter what happens in the world, 8 or 9% of the Germans make this absolutely rubbish vote for the far left. Is it destabilizing Germany? Is it undermining the economy? Is it breaking the euro? Is it undermining the credibility and the legitimacy of the German institutions? No. But what it does do, it articulates and it brings out into the open a particular group of people who think like that. Others then start saying around their beers and their whiskeys and their hamburgers when they talk and they chat, these guys are saying A, B, and C. Yeah, can we just think about this? Let's talk about this. Let's fight about this. Let's scream about this. And out of that, you get a much more mature political setup. I think the Germans are a remarkable example. So I actually am hugely in favor of Mr. Malema. I haven't publicly endorsed him yet, but coming from this position, I'm happy to do it.
Oh, I wish you'd told me that before I invited you as a public policy scholar. It's going to be an interesting 4 months. Okay, let's have some more questions, another round of questions. See a couple of hands right in the row there and then across here.
My name is Abdel Maliki. I'm from the Global Civil Initiative, and I'm originally from West Africa, Benin particularly. So I want to pick back on what Steve was saying and to the lady question about the role of South Africa in the African Union. And as you can know, the diversity of each part of Africa is creating a lot of tension with the small regional players, like we have ECOWAS, the SADC, and all those kind of things. And I think the whole continent is looking for a leader who can take us on the global world in order for speaking on one voice. And I want to ask you, my question is, what the role of South Africa on that, being that representative of the whole continent and be able to give one voice for the issue that we are talking about? And especially when we see South Africa asking all the African countries to get off of the International Criminal Court, which is the only thing who's taking all the president accountable for not bringing down the civil rights on the continent. And my second question directly to Mr. Mandela is, when you're talking about the elder system in Africa, which is a great thing that we have, but I think as a young people, we didn't challenge the elder enough in order to be able to have such a democratization of our continent, where we have all the leaders being on power for 20, 30 years, with all the bad governance that we're seeing. So coming from a great leader, how you seeing your role in the future to be able to challenge that leadership, that issue that we have? Thank you.
Okay, and right behind. Yes.
Hi, my name's Nikki. I'm an Atlas Core Fellow from South Africa. I'm here for a 12-month period. And I too, when I first arrived, was blown away by the volunteerism that happened here. Now that I'm going to be returning back home soon, it was pointed out to me in a study that was made on volunteerism. They kind of tallied it, volunteerism that happens in countries. In South Africa, to my surprise, ranked really, really highly. And it was according to the definition of what volunteerism is. And traditionally, the nation that we are and the people that we are, that's who we are. We volunteer, not under that term, but it's what we are, and it's that feeling of community that we have. Now that we are becoming more like the Europe on Africa and we're becoming more and more developed, we are losing that more and more. And I was wondering how we can try and bridge that gap as we're following the best practices that are being done in developing countries. How can we make sure that we don't have to go that full cycle, but that we actually take the kind of nation that we are and where we come from and bypass the step of having to go the route of that we have to go back and formalize volunteerism and that community building a nation?
Okay, thank you very much. And yes, the hand right there. Young man right there, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Matthew Harris. I'm a graduate student in political anthropology at the University of Chicago. Prior to that, I have experience working with an implementing partner of the UNHCR in the Western Cape of South Africa. So my question today speaks to a fairly common theme that several people have sort of brought up already regarding the relationship of South Africa to the rest of the continent. However, the angle that I sort of wanted to question about this is about migrants in South Africa and mobility. Working with refugees, I was blown away by the number of other sub-Saharan Africans moving into South Africa, Congolese, Rwandans, Zimbabweans, and then that in light of some of the recent xenophobic attacks that have happened in the past several years. I'm wondering what the role is for these people in the future of South Africa, particularly in light also of what Mr. Mandela has said about inclusion in the continent and how this might shape the future, or if it's a problem or possible ideas for incorporation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we only have time for this round of questions and responses, so I saw your hand, so take this one last question here, and then you all can respond and use it for any closing thoughts you might want to offer.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rabinowitz. I'm retired. And I have two questions. Interestingly, I asked them both yesterday at a different session here on African development. First, just this week, it was announced that Mo Ibrahim's African Good Governance Prize is not being awarded again for the fourth time in the past 5 years. And I'm wondering what we, as number one, the U.S., and also as individuals, could possibly do to help improve the governance situation in Africa. That's the first question. Second question, it's been about 75 years since the U.S. went to a 40-hour work week from what had been a 60-hour work week. Since that time, productivity off the farm has increased by at least a factor of 5, and farm productivity has increased even more than that, and the increased rate is growing. Now, most of this productivity increase has not gotten to Africa yet. When it does, there are going to be a lot of people who are currently doing agriculture who are looking for something to do. And today, with technology, and technology is increasing all the time, half a dozen countries can easily fill the entire global demand for manufactured products. So the question is, what are Africans going to actually be able to do? And is it possible, since Africa does not have this tradition of 40-hour work weeks, to actually leapfrog that whole tradition and come up with a totally new way to distribute wealth, which is what the working does?
Okay, well, some fascinating questions. Shall we start with JP this time, with the elder, and work our way towards Luvuyo to have the last comments?
Luvuyo is getting his revenge. Look, on the question of Mo Ibrahim, I just asked myself the question, are there any political leaders in the US at the moment to whom you would give the prize? You know, and if you go back a couple of years to a previous administration, were any candidates there for the prize? So I think one must handle that with a degree of carefulness. My own sense about good governance is your best improvement in good governance is when it comes from the inside. When there is now, you can use a variety of words. You can talk about culture change, you can talk about values, whatever. The formulation that I prefer is unlearning and relearning. Unlearning and relearning. And when that happens inside a community, inside a society, that's when I think you get your best chances on better government. I mean, I think that's the lesson that Mr. Bush had to learn in Iraq. You cannot bring democracy from the outside. It has to grow from the inside. Now, there are really lots of evidence that this process is playing itself out in South Africa, in Africa. Certainly in South Africa, but I think one can also say in respect of the continent at large. So I think the trajectory, the trend on improving governance is certainly there, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector. Take for example, Nigeria, where about 18 months ago, the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria dismissed, I think it was 7 bank CEOs from private sector banks because of their bad and poor bank governance. Now, to the best of my knowledge, that hasn't happened to any bank CEO in the US, in spite of the enormous atrocities committed by the US or the Anglo-Saxon financial system. So I'm relaxed about the trends around governance. On your issue of productivity, I can't talk for Africa, that's impossible, but let me tell you, your comments certainly do not hold for South Africa. In 1995, that's the critical year. You can then go and look at the data series. In 1995, up till 95, South Africa had very slow productivity growth. It's actually quite fascinating if you take a 30-year graph. And then in 95, man, it's like a knife coming down through butter. Productivity just shot through the roof. And this has basically gone on until 2010. There's now been a slowdown, but there was a substantial long run. And I think the scales have tipped, and I can't see that productivity progress being reversed. Let me give you one practical example. The South African agricultural sector today produces 20% more than what it produced in 94. Okay? Go from 100 to 120. The number of farmers farming in South Africa has reduced by 50%. Now, how do you square that circle? 50% fewer farmers, 20% more production. Only one way. Massive increases in productivity. And I think that agricultural story has been repeated in banking, it's been repeated in mining, it's being repeated in a variety of industries. So I'm fairly relaxed about productivity growth in the South African economy. I would counsel, just as a last comment, I would caution against the notion of treating all the countries of Africa as one homogeneous unit. You know, you can do it perhaps with the US. You can say in the US productivity has done this and that and the other, but I think you will agree with me, even in the US there will be a huge difference between, say, California and Minnesota. You know, I'm guessing here.
Or Mississippi.
Oh, your world. So I think one should draw down into a bigger level of detail for different economies. On your point of manufacturing, this is my last answer, it goes back to my point I made about demography. And you certainly underscored it. Your comment that there are a couple of countries now that can produce all the manufactured goods of the world, so how on earth will other countries create the jobs? Because there won't be manufacturing sectors. I think it's a very pertinent point to your issue of unemployment. The one unclaimed thing certainly for South Africa, but I would also venture for East Africa, where you come from, is tourism. And I just want to leave you with this number. The UK has got 60 million citizens, and they get 60 million tourists a year. Now, you've been to London, and you will know what is there, apart from bad weather, the Buckingham Palace and Shakespeare. Why on earth else do you go to the UK, you know? I mean, I've just done it now on my way to Washington, and I regret it. I don't understand why I wasted my money so much. Once you've walked around Buckingham Palace, you've walked around Buckingham Palace. Diana is dead now, so there's not even that allure. Now, South Africa has got a population of 53 million, and we get less than 5 million tourists a year. Can you imagine if we can repeat what the Brits are doing? 53 million citizens, 53 million tourists. Now that is business and industry. Bugger this old-fashioned model that there's only jobs in manufacturing. That is yesterday's thinking. You must go and look at the new ones. And to just say everybody should do technology, well, you're welcome. Go and try and compete with Silicon Valley. You've got no chance. But Silicon Valley can't compete with us because we've got rhinoceros and elephants. That's the competitive advantage. Go for it.
Thank you, JP.
I'm not going to answer this. I'm going to pass. The questions are too difficult.
Oh, no, Johnny.
I'm kidding. On the question that you raised around the African Union and how South Africa can play a leadership role in harnessing everybody, you know, I think it's a far more complex question than just that. When we went for our first tour of duty to the Security Council as a non-permanent member in 2007 to 2008, this is the proposal, this is a resolution that actually South Africa put on the table that was adopted, that we need to now have the UN actually give control or more say in what regional organizations do with regards to problems that are specific to a geographic region. And here specifically we're talking about the African Union. And then you've mentioned the issues around ECOWAS, SADC, and so on, and you would know that we took the lead when it came to the Zimbabwe situation, you know, and so it goes. I think it's going to be far more difficult. That is not the intention that we are striving for as a regional, as part of the regional integration process, that you end up with one super leader and whatever. Eventually, we want political unity, and probably at some date in the future, we're looking at monetary unity. But I think it will be really jumping the gun. I know that the late Muammar Gaddafi actually really wanted that central unified government as a goal that should be achieved now in his lifetime. So it's something that I think is a work in progress. And if you can look at how these actually RECs, what we call them RECs, the regional economic communities have been doing, they've been doing a very marvelous job in terms of, being unique, like you were talking about localized solutions, being unique to the localized problems that they are dealing with. And you are starting to see even the RECs now across like we have the tripartite RECs now that are actually working together towards finding solutions in the area of ICT and infrastructure. Our president, for example, is chairing the corridor that deals with NEPAD infrastructure. So it's a steady process. He would not be able to just overlook the issue of sovereignty overnight. It's an issue that you have to work with. We're still really preoccupied with geographic boundaries as well as jurisdictional sovereignty. And it's something the Europeans themselves have not overcome. Within the EU, they started the process in the 50s. So it's going to be an evolutionary rather than a revolutionary process, because at the same time, you don't want to destabilize what you've already built. You want the governments that are already transiting to democracy to take root and be stabilized as you move to that. You know that even with the Europeans themselves, they struggle with convergence criteria, to have a common inflation policy, to have harmonization of policies. It's not an easy thing that you do overnight. So those things are still going to take quite a bit. But at least what is important is that we do have a core of leadership. We do have a core institution with values, principles, objectives, and policies that actually govern us as a continent, something that at least we can work towards. And the achievements that we have done, it's remarkable. If you look from 2002, when we made the transition from the OAU to the AU, the progress has been remarkable, what these regional economic communities have achieved. On the issue of the tensions that exist amongst our communities, that is a very difficult one. As a government in South Africa, we take the view that, whatever these xenophobic attacks or whatever they were called are things that really we do not condone as government. We treat them as criminal incidences, attacks that are really unjustified, and wherever we spot such incidences, they are dealt with accordingly. We were talking earlier on with Luvuyo before the discussions began about, how you actually deal with this from a social perspective, which I think you can elegantly explain this. But it is bound that you're going to have these tensions as more economic migrants migrate towards the country. And JP has already articulated the issue of, dwindling resources and increasing demands, on the state. Because unlike other countries, we don't have designated refugee areas where we just put them in camps. We encourage them to actually integrate into communities, and with that comes all the benefits that we offer. If ever they have children that are less than 6 years of age, they benefit from our hospitals. So all those things also, go towards creating tensions as, there's this conflict in society, the struggle for the competition of resources. And it's something that as a government, we are maintaining a delicate balance for that. If I give a practical example in most recent memory, with the Zimbabwean situation, we're able there to have designated policy interventions where we said all the people that are of Zimbabwean origin that have the relevant documents and whatever can go and formally register as asylum seekers, and then they will be accorded the necessary status and benefits that come, with asylum seekers. So it's a very a separate topic on its own that requires much debate, but it's something that we take to heart, that it's a conversation that is not only restricted to the continent, but it finds its way here, that, there are all these social issues and tensions that emanate from us trying to move closer and closer as we integrate.
Okay. Those are some difficult questions, and this may seem a cop-out, but I think one thing that's important in leadership is also admitting when you don't know. So to be quite frank, some of these questions, I do not know the answer to them. And it's for platforms like this for us to actually ask the difficult questions and together actually go a long way to answering those difficult questions. So in that regard, instead of trying to seem as though I know any better, I'd like to focus on the questions that I actually know a little more about and I'm passionate and involved in. So to that effect, I'd like to speak to the migrant South Africa xenophobia and the volunteerism and Ubuntu. Strangely enough, you speak to the fact that from a volunteerism perspective, we are that type of people. And I was having a discussion with Mam Krasa and recently speaking about the growth of social entrepreneurship in South Africa and also speaking to who we are as an African people. And the truth of the matter is it's a term that's unfortunately been overused in South Africa, which is Ubuntu, but it is something that we're about. And I was engaging with my professor from Hamilton, and I'd like to proudly say that there are two Hamilton alums in attendance here, Wangeshi and Roya, fellow Hamiltonians. But I was engaging with a professor, Todd Franklin from Hamilton College, and I was telling him the type of work that I'm interested in doing. And his response was very interesting, and in fact, it's something that I want to now use as part of the things that I'll be doing going forward. And he talks about to give back, it is important, but to do it in the right way that it respects the humanity of others is very critical. And it's how you give back that becomes very important. And it feels like much of the volunteerism that has been growing in spurts is more of a look at me, look at what I've done, let's take a picture, let's do a photo op. So it's very one touch point, very fleeting, and more of a pat on your own shoulder rather than actually doing the good for that community. So in the work that I try and do and the environments that I operate in, I try and actually look at impact that is for the people that I'm trying to assist and also recognizes and respects their humanity and dignity. And one of the projects that I'm working with, and I was actually speaking with Ntate Moloto about it in terms of the xenophobia, my experience is that I was given an opportunity to go study at St. Anne's Belfield in Charlottesville, Virginia by a company called Miles & Associates. What they did was using basketball and the skill sets that young South Africans had would afford them scholarships in various communities that they had networks in. So I'm working on a project called Skew Circle, and it's a play on the words the expression full circle. The idea is that we all come full circle, but our journeys are never the same. And my intention, and with the group of people that we're working with together, is to identify young kids from townships in South Africa and channel them through the better schooling systems in South Africa, and then possibly get them the opportunity of studying in the US in grade 11 and 12. The main objective of that is to create global citizens out of kids from townships, and that goes a long way at solving the issue of xenophobia. Xenophobic attacks happen because people feel like I don't have an opportunity to employ and feed my family, and here are all these people that are coming into this environment and taking away the jobs. Truth of the matter is, a lot of the jobs that are being taken, those people weren't interested in filling anyway. So it also comes from a perspective of getting people that are from the community to get out of South Africa and those townships and actually learn that in the greater scheme of things, you're a foreigner as well. You'll come to America, people won't understand your accent, people won't be able to pronounce your name, and as South Africans, you'll go through the experience that our fellow northern brothers and sisters go through when they come into South Africa, which will help in eroding that impression that we as South Africans are better than the rest of the continent. So the intention is to actually take kids out of that environment, because I as Luvuyo won't be able to go in the environment and actually engage with them responsibly because there's a cutoff. You're not from here. So you're telling me something that's an urban or a suburban understanding. But if we can take kids from the townships and say, go have a global experience, and you yourself come back and be the role model that says, actually, it's not okay to do that. And once we start changing communities, and it's part of the solutions that we're speaking to from within, it makes a lot more sense. You can never necessarily come as an outsider and say, I know better about your community. But if you can take some of the people who have promise in those communities and say, take a break, go outside, and come back in. Example, it's not something that I'm not proud of, but it's an example nonetheless. When I was in South Africa, I would engage in part of the conversations that used to identify non-South Africans as Amakwerekwer. It's not as drastic as setting someone's store alight, but from a person who has no business trying to put someone else down, Not to say that the people that are from the townships have a business doing so, but that's something that I engage in. I unlearned that the moment that I got to the US and I realized, okay, I am far away from home. And that actually allowed me to engage with a number of different people from different countries. Before South Africa, probably couldn't mention many people from different countries. Before just staying in South Africa, having gone and had an international experience, I'm able to say, well, I have friends from various regions in South Africa. And I don't want to sound like one of those people that says I have 2 friends from that region. I just have friends from those regions. And then I think in engaging in a lot of, the intention is twofold with Skew Circle. One, to help with elevating and getting kids a high standard of education. That's one. The second part is to actually help in creating a global perspective for all South Africans. Yes, we do have a lot of the continental issues, but unless we're put in an environment where we're forced to identify, well, some of the younger generations are forced to identify their fellow Africans as brothers and sisters, it's going to be hard to engage. One of the simple things that I was discussing with the gentleman from Senegal was one of the problems that we have as South Africans engaging with the rest of the continent is that we don't speak French. The rest of the continent is a francophone nation, and the majority of us don't speak French. So how do we realistically expect to come into francophone nations and do business? You'll sit around the table right here, you'll discuss a deal, and someone will then lean over and say whatever it is they say in their language, and then you're automatically left out the loop. So until we actually start teaching the next generation, okay, if you have an interest of looking into the rest of the continent, well, what does the rest of the continent use as a language of engagement? For us, as we use English as the global community, for the African continent is predominantly French. So I think also in South Africans, we also in earnest need to start looking at saying, how much French are we introducing into our schools, and how can we start doing cultural exchanges within the continent? We're more than welcoming of saying, well, we'll take an exchange student from Germany, we'll take an exchange student from wherever else. But at least when I was in high school, I'm sure much of that has changed since, but when I was in high school, there were very few exchange students from the rest of the continent other than kids that had moved and their families were now part of the South African community. So I think from that perspective, there's a lot of ways of changing the mindsets. A crazy idea, and you said not to formalize volunteerism, but a crazy idea I thought of is, why don't we do NGO conscription? Kids graduate from high school, they don't necessarily know what they want to do. Put them in an environment where they're doing something constructive with their time and still learning about what it is that they're doing. So you identify a few NGOs that are having high impact, and then you channel those kids through there. They spend a year, and then they also don't spend that time wasting their parents' money thinking, oh, I spent a year in this program and don't kind of like it. But if you thought that you liked accounting and you spent some time doing the bookkeeping during the NGO conscription, you'll soon learn whether or not you like it or whether you don't. And when you go into varsity, you'll be focused on saying, I really like this, or maybe I'll try another subject. So that's that perspective. And I think in terms of your question in that, do we challenge enough of the elders? Funnily enough, during the Mo Ibrahim, I feel like I'm going to regret saying this, but anyway. During the Mo Ibrahim engagement, I sat there thinking to myself, well, it's all well and great having this index, but is it really realistic? Is it honestly realistic? If we can sit and then say in first world and developed nations, we cannot confidently identify a government that's been run efficiently such that the first world would be awarded that prize. So is it essentially realistic to have those type of measures? Not to say that we should bring the standard down, but can we actually look at that index critically and say, is it realistic, and can we be in a situation in the foreseeable future where we can then identify an African nation saying, well done, you've led your people very well. So I think that would be one space where I'd say as young people, something that maybe we need to challenge and saying we have some things to celebrate on the continent, but while it's great to aspire for greatness, is it realistic to expect that some of those measures and standards in that index are reachable? And I think that would be one point of that. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Steve.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has been a very, very enlightening morning. I as we talk about generational transitions, generational change, I very much am impressed by the respect you've given to elders and the role that elders play. But what comes out of this, of course, is that there's a great deal of wisdom with youth too, and a great deal of candor, and that's appreciated. And as long as you're picking and choosing what you do know something about and what you don't know something about. You're asking the right questions and the pointed questions and the probing questions. I think the future is in good hands. I'm very impressed by what I've heard this morning. Before we have our final closure, Luvuyo, when he started, said something again with candor and self-deprecation. He talked about, well, maybe he'll do a little name dropping. Well, I do caution you all when you go home to your peers, to your friends, to your family this afternoon, that you don't say I spent the morning with Mandela. You point out which Mandela it was, so that we don't get people mixed up here. So let's all be a little humble here. And what a wonderful trio I have of wonderful South Africans, which I think does speak well for the future of South Africa. Help me in thanking them for this wonderful morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Do you have a card?